Today's exercise is to try and work out which electronic control units each piece of data comes from so that I can work out what the anomalies are in the data that we've noticed so far. This is primarily concerned with what we think might be missing key cycles. Are they actually missing, or were they just not recorded? And then also the time gap between the supposed 3-point turn and the supposed alleged incident data, which appears to be missing 8 minutes. So I did get ChatGPT's help with this, but I'm going to spare you those screen recordings. Essentially what I did was I drilled down into some real world crash data and which electronic control units record that data. And then I compared it to this chart that Trooper Paul provided with the key cycles listed on it. And we were able to establish that it most likely came from the CAN bus system. This system doesn't have a memory storage capacity. It basically quizzes the other devices and asks it questions about triggering events. So if you're driving your car normally, like you normally do, and you're not slamming on the brakes and doing unusual activities, no triggering events will be recorded in any of the electronic control units. It's only when your driving behaviour deviates from normal, which the systems learn while you're driving them over a period of time, but when your driving behaviour deviates, that's when a triggering event occurs. So for example, in my own car, if it's only me driving it, then it's getting used to my driving patterns. Then as soon as my son jumps in it and starts driving it, it starts behaving differently. It feels different on the throttle, it feels different on the brakes, the steering feels different. So when my son's finished roosting for the moment and goes off and does his own thing again, I can disconnect the ECU from the battery and reset it. It will then learn my patterns all over again and it'll be back to responding to how I drive it. So I would imagine a CAN bus report will probably show those periods when my son comes home to roost and starts driving my car again. So essentially that's what this report is here. If I had to guess, I would say there is an earlier key cycle, at least one, that shows Karen responding to hitting John's car at 5:03 a.m. because that would be a deviation from normal driving patterns and would trigger an event. I wouldn't expect to see all of the key cycle events listed in this chart because it's only asking about triggering events where driver behaviour deviated from normal. So when Alan Jackson stepped backwards through these key cycle events, he wasn't suggesting that that data was missing. He was simply pointing out that this triggered event at 01162 was not Karen's driving pattern because it was in the possession of Michael Proctor by that stage. By mere virtue of him being a different driver, it was obviously going to trigger an event, unless he drove it exactly the same way that Karen drives it, which is not likely. Men generally do drive vehicles differently to women. In fact, we see the most recorded events when Trooper Paul takes possession of the car. No triggered event at 01163 probably indicates that Michael Proctor moved the vehicle outside of the sally port for Trooper Paul to test it. And then from 01164 onwards, you can clearly see triggered event after triggered event, because he's deliberately trying to recreate the scenario that Michael Proctor gave him to recreate. It not only records the triggered events from the different driving behaviour, but it also records how many times that event was triggered. So it looks like Trooper Paul conducted at least 30 tests, because the completion column actually counts 29, 30 and 30 events on the traction control history, the ABS and the sudden braking history. That there was no sudden braking history recorded at 01162 is also indicative that no sudden braking occurred during key cycle 01162. And that is significant because during cycle 01162 is when Trooper Paul claims the incident occurred. Remember, she was supposed to have backed up 62 feet at 24 miles per hour, hit the picks and not crashed into Higgy's so-called apparent Jeep. Anyway, the exercise of filling in which key cycle Michael Proctor took possession of the car works pretty much the same way that AJ described it, counting backwards through the key cycles from the known events that occurred. That is, those events that we can pull timestamps from that came from CCTV footage. That data is probably going to look something like this. As I just mentioned, 01163 is most likely Proctor driving as he did in 01162 so as not to trigger an event, moving the vehicle out for testing by Trooper Paul. Key cycle 1162 is most likely related to reversing the vehicle out of the workshop, turning it round and driving it in forwards, for which the forwards part we have CCTV footage, although the timestamps are questionable. The existence of this new camera angle footage of the vehicle being reversed into the Sallyport puts the unloading event from the flatbed tow truck onto a different key cycle. Key cycle 01661. Prior to that, we know it travelled approximately 36 miles to the workshop, i.e. the Sallyport, and we know the engine was turned off during that time. Therefore, loading it onto the tow truck had to be key cycle 01160. And that's it. That's all that matters to the jury. That from key cycle 1160 onwards, Karen did not have possession of the vehicle, and therefore any events triggered after 1160 could not have been triggered by her. It's as simple as that. End of demonstration. This should only take 3 to 4 minutes to explain to a jury. During closing, during cross-examination, you can go into a whole lot more depth about what else happened when that vehicle was in her possession and which key cycle was actually at 34 Fairview Road. So let's continue with Alan Jackson's theory, working backwards through the key cycles to work out which key cycle was at 34 Fairview Road. The next event that we know happened, because we've got CCTV footage again, was Karen and her father arriving in his driveway. We also know it's approximately 29 miles travel between One Meadows and Mr. Reed's driveway. There's also footage of Karen and co dropping off the vehicle at One Meadows before they head off to go looking for John. We know she came from the direction of either Jen McCabe's house or Kerry's house, and that would have been around 2.4 kilometres. Whether or not she turned her ignition off or left it on to keep the car warm while she was at whoever's house screaming, "Jen! Jen! Kerry! Kerry!" What was I saying? Oh, whether or not she turned her ignition off is debatable. I suspect maybe not, because she was in a hurry and wanted to go find John. And so I'm going to call all key cycles previous to 1157 plus or minus one key cycle. So the point at which Karen hit John's car that morning possibly happened on key cycle 1156 or 1157. One thing is for sure, she travelled approximately 2.4 kilometres. Prior to that, on approximately key cycle 1155 or 1156, we know from John's Wi-Fi connection that she connected at 12:36 a.m. Prior to that, we know she arrived at 34 Fairview and dropped John off. That is not in dispute. We do know the entire trip from the Waterfall Bar to 34 Fairview Road back to One Meadows was all on the same key cycle, because she didn't get out of the car. Therefore, if Trooper Paul's calculations do not include key cycle 1155 or key cycle 1156, then the incident that he's referring to could not have occurred at 34 Fairview Road. Now, obviously, Karen's team can be way more specific about which key cycle we're talking about here, because they have access to Karen, who knows whether she turned her ignition off when she went to see Jen and Kerry. This is just my best guesstimation given the evidence that we've seen so far. So, what we need to know is which vehicle system did this data come from, and which key cycle is it connected to, and why is there an 8-minute gap between this alleged incident and the 3-point turn alleged incident. Stay tuned because we're going to dive into that one next.